September 12, 1853. The town of Millfield, Massachusetts, lay shrouded in autumn's first chill, when death visited the Marlow household twice in a single night. What should have been a simple memorial photograph would instead become one of the most disturbing mysteries in the annals of early American photography. In the parlor of the Marlow family home, two young women lay in eternal repose, their pale hands folded across silent chests. Sarah, 22 years of age, and her younger sister Elizabeth, 19, had succumbed within hours of each other to what the town physician diagnosed as a sudden fever. Their deaths were swift, unexpected, and by all accounts, final. Post-mortem photography was no stranger to mid-19th century America. In an era when the camera was still a luxury and death an ever-present companion, families commissioned photographers to capture final images of their departed loved ones. These daguerreotypes served as treasured keepsakes, often the only photographic record a family would possess of a child, parent, or sibling taken too soon. The practice required delicate artistry. Bodies were arranged to appear peaceful, even lifelike. Eyes were sometimes propped open or painted onto closed lids. Cheeks were pinched to restore color. Children were posed as if sleeping in their mother's arms. Adults sat upright in chairs, supported by hidden stands, their faces composed in serene expressions that denied the finality of their condition. On that September morning, as golden light filtered through the Marlow parlor windows, photographer Jonathan Blake prepared his equipment with practiced reverence. He had performed this solemn duty dozens of times before. The Marlow sisters would be no different, or so he believed. But when Blake developed the daguerreotype 3 days later, examining the silver-plated image in his darkroom, he discovered something that would haunt him for the remainder of his days. In the photograph, one sister appeared unmistakably different from the other. While Sarah's eyes held the familiar, vacant stare of the deceased, Elizabeth's pupils seemed dilated with life. Her chest appeared to rise with the faintest suggestion of breath. The question that would torment the town of Millfield for families maintained elaborate mourning practices that could last for years. Black crepe adorned windows and doors. Mirrors were covered. Clocks were stopped at the moment of death. Yet beneath these ritualistic displays lay a more profound anxiety, the growing awareness that medicine, despite its advances, remained fallible in its most fundamental diagnosis. The determination of death itself was still largely a matter of observation rather than scientific certainty. Physicians relied on the absence of breath, the stillness of the heart, and the cooling of the body to confirm what they hoped was true. But the medical journals of the period were filled with disturbing accounts of premature diagnosis. Cases of catalepsy, a condition where the body becomes rigid and unresponsive, while consciousness may remain intact, were often mistaken for death. Cholera, typhoid, and other diseases could induce comas so deep that even experienced physicians were deceived. The terror of being buried alive was not mere superstition, but a recognized medical concern. Safety coffins, equipped with bells and breathing tubes, were patented and sold to anxious families. Literature of the period was filled with tales of scratching sounds from freshly covered graves, and the discovery of bodies that had clearly awakened too late. Edgar Allan Poe's stories resonated so deeply precisely because they gave voice to a fear that lurked in every Victorian heart. Photography itself added another layer of complexity to this relationship with death. The daguerreotype process, introduced to America in the 1840s, required subjects to remain perfectly still for exposure times that could last several minutes. The slightest movement would blur the image beyond recognition. In a cruel irony, the dead made ideal photographic subjects, possessing the stillness that the living struggled to maintain. This technological limitation created an unsettling parallel between the living and the dead in the photographer's studio. Both required absolute motionlessness. Both were positioned and posed by the photographer's guiding hand. The line between a living portrait and a memorial photograph was often disturbingly thin. The Marlow family occupied a respect claimed both sisters struck without warning. On the evening of September 10th, both young women complained of headaches and fatigue. By dawn, they had fallen into what Dr. Ephraim Whitmore, the town physician, described as a deep stupor. Their breathing became shallow, their pulses weak and irregular. By the following evening, both sisters lay still and cold. Dr. Whitmore, a Harvard-educated physician with 30 years of experience, pronounced both sisters dead at approximately 9 o'clock on the evening of September 11th. He noted in his records that their symptoms were consistent with a sudden fever, possibly typhoid, though the rapid progression puzzled him. The cause remained officially undetermined. What Dr. Whitmore could not have known was that his diagnosis would soon be called into question by the unblinking eye of the camera, and that his reputation would become entangled in one of the most disturbing mysteries of the century. In the dim parlor of the Marlow home, photographer Jonathan Blake arranged his equipment with the methodical precision of long practice. The heavy camera, mounted on its wooden tripod, commanded the center of the room like a silent witness. The silver-plated daguerreotype plate, polished to mirror brightness, awaited the image that would soon be etched upon its surface by light and chemistry. Blake was a man of 45 years, with graying temples and hands steady from decades of working with delicate photographic equipment. He had come to Millfield from Boston 5 years earlier, drawn by the growing demand for photographic services in the smaller towns of Massachusetts. He had captured countless family portraits, wedding ceremonies, and solemn memorial photographs. Nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he would witness that September morning. The sisters had been laid out in the front parlor, the room reserved for the family's most formal occasions. Heavy velvet curtains blocked the harsh light of morning, replaced by the soft glow of oil lamps, positioned to illuminate the subjects' faces. Sarah and Elizabeth lay side by side on a narrow daybed, their bodies arranged with careful attention to dignity and grace. Both sisters wore their finest dresses, white silk with delicate lace collars that had been sewn by their mother years earlier. Their dark hair had been carefully brushed and arranged in the fashion of the preparations. Blake became aware of something that troubled him. Later, in his private diary, he would write, "There was something in the atmosphere of that room that spoke not of death, but of waiting. I cannot explain this feeling, only that it persisted throughout my work." Blake approached the daybed to make a final adjustment to Elizabeth's position. Her left hand had slipped slightly from its crossed position, and he reached out to correct it. As his fingers touched her wrist, he froze. Later testimony would reveal what he experienced in that moment. A sensation so subtle it might have been imagination, yet so distinct that it haunted him for the remainder of his life. "I felt the faintest flutter," Blake would later tell Dr. Whitmore, "like the wing of a dying moth against my palm." When questioned further, he admitted that what he believed he felt was a pulse, so weak and irregular that it barely registered against his fingertips. Blake stepped back from the daybed, his hands trembling. He looked closely at Elizabeth's face, searching for any sign of life. Her complexion was pale, but not yet waxy. Her lips retained a hint of natural color. Most disturbing of all, her eyelids seemed to flutter almost imperceptibly, as though she were dreaming. Margaret Marlow, who had been sitting quietly in the corner of the room, noticed Blake's hesitation. "Is something wrong, Mr. Blake?" she inquired, her voice barely above a whisper. Blake looked from Elizabeth to her mother, then back to the still form on the daybed. He was a practical man, not given to flights of fancy or superstitious beliefs. Yet something about Elizabeth's appearance troubled him deeply. "Mrs. Marlow," he said carefully, "when did Dr. Whitmore last examine your daughters?" "Last evening, when he pronounced them gone," Margaret replied. "He said they were at peace." Blake nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. He had seen enough death to recognize its unmistakable signs: the waxy pallor of skin, the absolute stillness of breath, the gradual cooling of the body. Elizabeth displayed none of these characteristics. Lens cap with a soft click that seemed to echo through the parlor like the closing of a coffin lid. The photograph was complete, but Blake's unease remained. In 3 days, when the image was finally developed, his worst fears would be confirmed in ways he could never have imagined. 3 days after the photograph was taken, Jonathan Blake stood in his darkroom, staring at an image that defied every assumption he had ever held about his craft. The daguerreotype of the Marlow sisters lay before him, its silver surface reflecting the lamplight like a mirror touched by shadows. The developing process had proceeded normally. Blake had treated the exposed plate with mercury vapor, then fixed the image with a solution of salt water. These were techniques he had performed hundreds of times, and he expected nothing unusual in the result. What he discovered instead would haunt him for the remainder of his life. Sarah Marlow appeared in the photograph exactly as Blake expected. Her face bore the unmistakable stillness of death, her eyes closed in eternal repose. The shadows fell naturally across her features, creating the somber dignity typical of memorial photography. She looked peaceful, removed from the world of the living, in the way that only the truly deceased could appear. Elizabeth, however, was different in ways that made Blake's hands shake as he held the daguerreotype up to the light. Her eyes, which he remembered as being closed during the photography session, appeared slightly open in the image. More disturbing still, her pupils seemed dilated and alive, catching the light with an intensity that spoke not of death, but of consciousness struggling against overwhelming darkness. The angle of Elizabeth's head was wrong as well. Blake distinctly remembered positioning her face to match her sister's pose, yet in the photograph, her head appeared turned slightly, as though she had moved during the long exposure. Her lips, which should have been pressed together in the stillness of death, were parted, as if she had been struggling to speak or breathe. Most unsettling of all was Elizabeth's chest. While Sarah's torso remained perfectly flat beneath her funeral dress, Elizabeth's appeared to rise in the slightest suggestion of breath, him from taking this course of action. Blake had been photographing the dead for over a decade, and he had learned to recognize the subtle signs that distinguished death from sleep. He had never before seen a post-mortem photograph that displayed such clear evidence of life persisting within apparent death. The technical quality of the image was otherwise excellent, showing none of the blurring or distortion that typically accompanied flawed exposures. On the afternoon of September 15th, Blake made a decision that would transform a private family memorial into a public mystery. He took the daguerreotype to Dr. Ephraim Whitmore's office and laid it before the physician who had pronounced both sisters dead. Dr. Whitmore examined the image in silence for several long minutes, his face growing increasingly troubled. Finally, he looked up at Blake with an expression the photographer had never seen on the usually confident physician's face. "Where exactly did you position the subjects during the exposure?" Whitmore asked. Blake described the photography session in detail, emphasizing his careful positioning of both sisters in identical poses. He mentioned his momentary concern about Elizabeth's appearance, but admitted that he had dismissed his doubts as unfounded anxiety. Dr. Whitmore continued to study the daguerreotype, paying particular attention to the differences between the two sisters' appearances. "Mr. Blake," he said finally, "in your professional opinion, does this image show any signs of technical failure or improper exposure?" "None that I can identify," Blake replied honestly. "The image quality is consistent with my best work. If I were to speculate, I would say this photograph captured exactly what existed at the moment of exposure." The implications of this statement hung heavily in the air between the two men. If Blake's assessment was correct, the daguerreotype provided evidence that Elizabeth Marlow had been alive when pronounced dead by the town's most respected physician. The consequences of such a revelation would extend far beyond the reputation of any single individual. Dr. Whitmore carefully wrapped the daguerreotype in cloth and locked it in his desk drawer. "Mr. Blake," he said gravely, "I believe this matter requires the churches and private homes. What started as a medical curiosity quickly transformed into something far more troubling, a challenge to the fundamental assumptions upon which the community's understanding of life and death was built." The first public examination of the photograph took place on October 1, 1853, in the parlor of Reverend Josiah Hartwell's home. Present were Dr. Whitmore, Jonathan Blake, Reverend Hartwell himself, and three prominent members of the community: Judge William Thornton, Merchant Samuel Clark, and Professor Daniel Morrison from the nearby Millfield Seminary. The daguerreotype was placed on a table beneath the brightest oil lamp available, and each man was invited to examine it closely. The reactions varied dramatically. Judge Thornton, a practical man accustomed to evaluating evidence, noted the clear differences between the two sisters' appearances, but cautioned against drawing supernatural conclusions from what might be natural phenomena. Professor Morrison, whose studies included natural philosophy and the emerging field of photography, observed that the different lighting conditions in the room might have created shadows that resembled signs of life. He pointed out that the human eye, especially when influenced by expectation or anxiety, could perceive patterns where none actually existed. Reverend Hartwell's response was more troubling to those present. After studying the image for several minutes in complete silence, the elderly clergyman looked up with an expression of profound unease. "Gentlemen," he said slowly, "I have officiated at more funerals than I care to count, and I have seen death in all its forms. What I observe in this photograph is not the peaceful countenance of one who has passed into eternal rest." Dr. Whitmore, whose reputation was most directly challenged by the implications of the photograph, maintained that his examination of both sisters had been thorough and his diagnosis correct. He suggested that post-mortem changes in the body might have occurred between the time of death and the photography session, creating the appearance of life where none actually existed. Yet, even as he offered these explanations, Dr. Whitmore's confidence seemed shaken. Later examination of his private papers would reveal his growing doubts about. Still were the reports that began to emerge from the Marlow household itself. Margaret Marlow, initially resistant to any suggestion that her daughter's deaths had been misdiagnosed, began to confide in her closest friends about disturbing experiences since the funeral. She spoke of hearing footsteps in the upstairs hallway during the hours before dawn, always stopping outside the room that had been shared by Sarah and Elizabeth. The sound was light, she said, like that of a young woman in soft slippers, moving carefully so as not to wake sleeping family members. On several occasions, Margaret reported finding Elizabeth's former bedroom mysteriously disturbed. The bed would appear to have been slept in, with the coverlet pulled back and the pillow bearing the impression of a head. When questioned about these incidents, other family members denied entering the room, which had been kept locked since the funeral. Most disturbing of all were the roses. Elizabeth had maintained a small garden behind the house, specializing in late-blooming varieties that flowered well into October. Since her death, the scent of roses had begun appearing throughout the house, strongest in the parlor where the photography session had taken place, and in Elizabeth's former bedroom. The roses in Elizabeth's garden had been cut back after her death, yet the fragrance persisted, growing stronger rather than fading with time. Neighbors visiting the Marlow home reported the same phenomenon, describing a smell so intense it seemed almost oppressive, like the overwhelming perfume of a funeral parlor. Thomas Marlow, who had initially dismissed his wife's reports as the product of grief-stricken imagination, began to experience his own unsettling encounters. On the night of October 7th, he was awakened by the sound of someone playing the piano in the front parlor. The melody was soft and melancholy, one of Elizabeth's favorite hymns. When Thomas investigated, he found the parlor empty and silent, but the piano bench was pulled out from the instrument, and sheet music was scattered on the floor. The music was Elizabeth's handwriting, pieces she had copied out for her own practice. No other family member claimed responsibility for the disturbance. Dr. Whitmore, troubled by these reports and his own growing doubts about the case, proposal. If there is any possibility, she told her husband privately, that we have failed one of our daughters in her time of greatest need, then we must know the truth, regardless of the cost to our own peace of mind. The decision to proceed with the exhumation would prove to be the most consequential choice made by anyone involved in the Marlow case, setting in motion events that would haunt the town of Millfield for generations to come. On the morning of November 3, 1853, a small procession made its way through the gates of Millfield Cemetery under the cover of pre-dawn darkness. Present were Dr. Whitmore, Thomas Marlow, Judge Thornton as a legal witness, Reverend Hartwell to oversee the religious aspects of the proceedings, and two gravediggers sworn to secrecy about their work. The exhumation had been planned in absolute secrecy to avoid the spectacle that would surely have resulted from public knowledge of the proceedings. Even Margaret Marlow had been persuaded to remain at home, though she had insisted that she be informed immediately of any discoveries. The graves of Sarah and Elizabeth Marlow lay side by side in the newer section of the cemetery, marked by matching granite headstones that Thomas had commissioned from a Boston monument maker. The sisters had been buried in identical coffins of polished oak with silver handles, surrounded by the flowers from Elizabeth's garden that had continued to bloom despite the advancing season. Sarah's grave was opened first. The work proceeded slowly, as the gravediggers were careful to preserve the integrity of both the coffin and its contents. When the oak lid was finally raised, those present saw exactly what they had expected: the peaceful remains of a young woman who had died naturally and been properly prepared for burial. Sarah's body showed the expected signs of decomposition for the 5 weeks that had passed since her interment. Her features remained recognizable, but the lifelike appearance she had possessed at the time of burial had been replaced by the unmistakable pallor of death. Her position within the coffin was exactly as she had been placed there, her hands still folded across her chest, her expressions serene and undisturbed. Dr. Whitmore conducted a Thornton would later write in his private papers, "I have presided over trials involving the most heinous crimes known to civilized society. Yet I have never witnessed anything that affected me as profoundly as what we discovered in that grave." Elizabeth's body had not remained in the peaceful pose in which she had been buried. Her position within the coffin had changed dramatically, with her left arm raised toward the lid and her head turned to one side. Her fingers were bloodied and broken, and splinters of wood beneath her fingernails provided unmistakable evidence that she had attempted to claw her way out of her confinement. Most horrifying of all was Elizabeth's face. Her jaw hung open in what could only be described as a silent scream, and her eyes were wide with an expression of absolute terror. The peaceful countenance that had characterized her appearance at the time of burial had been replaced by a visage that spoke of unimaginable anguish and desperate, futile struggle. Dr. Whitmore's examination revealed additional evidence of Elizabeth's awakening within the grave. The lining of the coffin showed tears and stains consistent with attempts to escape. The silver handles on the inside of the lid bore scratches from her fingernails. Most disturbing of all, the position of her body and the condition of her clothing indicated that she had been conscious and active for a considerable period after burial. Reverend Hartwell, who had maintained his composure throughout the examination of Sarah's remains, was visibly shaken by Elizabeth's condition. "Dear God," he whispered, "what suffering this child must have endured in her final hours." The implications of the discovery were staggering. Elizabeth Marlow had been buried alive, awakening in the darkness of her coffin to find herself trapped in a nightmare beyond human comprehension. She had died not from the fever that Dr. Whitmore had diagnosed, but from suffocation and terror in the confines of her grave. The daguerreotype, dismissed by some as a trick of light and shadow, had indeed captured evidence of life persisting within apparent death. Jonathan Blake's photographic plate had recorded the faint signs of consciousness that medical examination had failed. Similar errors in other cases will haunt me for the remainder of my days. The reburial of both sisters took place immediately, with Reverend Hartwell conducting a private ceremony attended only by the Marlow family. Elizabeth was provided with a new coffin equipped with a bell system that would allow her to signal if she awakened, though all present understood that this precaution came too late to save her from the horror she had already endured. The daguerreotype that had revealed the truth about Elizabeth's condition was locked away in Judge Thornton's safe, where it would remain hidden from public view for decades to come. The terrible secret of what the photograph had shown would be shared only among those who had witnessed the exhumation and sworn themselves to silence. In the weeks following the exhumation of the Marlow sisters, the daguerreotype that had revealed Elizabeth's terrible fate seemed to take on a life of its own. Despite Judge Thornton's efforts to keep the photograph secure in his safe, reports began to circulate that the image had been seen in locations throughout Massachusetts and beyond. The first such report came from a collector of photographic curiosities in Boston, who claimed to have purchased the daguerreotype from a traveling merchant in late November. The collector, Harold Pembridge, displayed the photograph at a gathering of photography enthusiasts, describing it as an exceptional example of post-mortem photography that captured the very moment when life departs the human form. When Judge Thornton learned of this development, he immediately traveled to Boston to investigate. What he found in Pembridge's collection was indeed a daguerreotype of two young women, but upon close examination, he determined that this was not the original Marlow photograph. The image was similar in composition, but lacked the distinctive details that had made the original so disturbing. Pembridge insisted that his daguerreotype was authentic, purchased in good faith from a merchant who claimed to have obtained it directly from the photographer. When pressed for more details about the transaction, however, Pembridge's account became vague and contradictory. The merchant had provided no documentation of the photograph's provenance, and Pembridge had no way to verify its authenticity. More troubling still were reports from the Marlow sisters, and that this original had never left Millfield, except in the judge's custody. The proliferation of alleged Marlow photographs created a disturbing possibility that someone with knowledge of the original image was creating forgeries for sale to collectors of macabre curiosities. The market for unusual photographs was growing rapidly among wealthy enthusiasts, and a post-mortem daguerreotype with such a compelling story would command a substantial price. Yet the technical quality of some of the reported copies was so high that experts questioned whether they could be forgeries at all. The daguerreotype process was complex and difficult to master, requiring specialized equipment and considerable skill. Creating convincing copies of an existing image would have been extremely challenging, even for an experienced photographer. Dr. Whitmore, despite his retirement from active practice, became involved in investigating these mysterious appearances. His guilt over Elizabeth's fate had transformed into an obsession, with understanding how the photograph had apparently multiplied and spread beyond Millfield's borders. In December of 1853, Dr. Whitmore received a letter from a colleague at Harvard Medical School, who had heard rumors of an unusual daguerreotype being circulated among physicians interested in the boundary between life and death. The colleague requested permission to examine the photograph for possible inclusion in a medical journal article about catalepsy and premature burial. Dr. Whitmore's response revealed the extent to which the Marlow case had shaken his confidence in medical science. "The photograph you describe has become something far beyond a simple medical curiosity. I fear that its continued circulation serves not to advance scientific understanding, but to promote superstition and panic among the general population." The truth about the photograph's distribution would never be fully established, but evidence suggests that copies were indeed being created and sold throughout New England and beyond. Whether these copies were forgeries created for profit or somehow authentic reproductions of the original remained a mystery that authorities were never able to resolve. By the spring of 1854, the winter months when such plants should have been dormant, the daguerreotype that had started this chain of events remained locked in Judge Thornton's safe. But its influence continued to spread through increasingly fantastic stories and alleged sightings. Some claimed that the photograph moved when viewed directly, with Elizabeth's eyes following the observer around the room. Others insisted that the image changed depending on who was looking at it, sometimes showing Elizabeth with her eyes closed in death, sometimes with them open in life. These supernatural embellishments obscured the real horror of what the photograph had revealed. that medical science of the mid-19th century was fallible in its most fundamental determinations, and that the line between life and death was far more uncertain than anyone wanted to acknowledge. The case of the Marlow sisters would eventually fade from public memory, but its impact on medical practice and photographic documentation of death would persist for decades to come. The terrible possibility that Elizabeth Marlow had been photographed in the final moments of her conscious life would haunt everyone who had been involved in the case, serving as a reminder that even in an age of advancing scientific knowledge, mystery and horror could emerge from the most routine of human activities. By 1865, more than a decade after the tragic events in Millfield, the original daguerreotype of the Marlow sisters had effectively vanished from documented history. Judge Thornton's death in 1862 had resulted in the contents of his safe being distributed among various legal and family interests, but no record exists of what became of the photograph that had caused such disturbance to the community. Some accounts suggest that Judge Thornton, in his final illness, ordered the daguerreotype to be destroyed, rather than allow it to continue causing distress to those who encountered it. His housekeeper reported finding ashes in the fireplace of his study that might have been the remains of photographic materials, but no definitive evidence of the image's destruction was ever found. Other stories claim that the photograph was purchased by a private collector who specialized in unusual photographic specimens. This collector, whose identity was never established, traveling shows throughout the 1870s and 80s. In 1873, a newspaper in Chicago published an account of a traveling photography exhibition that featured a daguerreotype of two deceased sisters, one of whom appears to show signs of life at the moment of exposure. The description matched the Marlow photograph in several key details, though the article made no mention of the Massachusetts origins of the image. A similar account appeared in a San Francisco newspaper in 1878, describing a photographic curiosity displayed at a traveling carnival. The reporter noted that viewers of the photograph often became visibly distressed, with several women fainting and men expressing profound unease at what they observed in the image. Whether these sightings represented the original Marlow daguerreotype or one of the many copies that had circulated in the years following the exhumation remained impossible to determine. What was certain was that the image, or images resembling it, continued to appear in locations far removed from the small Massachusetts town where the tragedy had occurred. The Marlow family's attempt to escape their notoriety by relocating to the countryside proved only partially successful. While they were able to avoid the daily reminders of their loss that had made life in Millfield unbearable, they could not escape the growing legend that surrounded Elizabeth's premature burial and the photograph that had revealed it. Thomas Marlow died in 1867, his health broken by years of guilt and grief over his daughter's fate. His final words, according to Margaret, were an apology to Elizabeth for failing to recognize the signs of life that the camera had captured. Margaret survived her husband by 15 years, spending her final decades in almost complete isolation on their remote farm. The last member of the immediate Marlow family to die was James, the youngest son, who had been only 12 years old at the time of his sisters' deaths. James grew to adulthood, haunted by memories of the tragedy, and spent much of his life attempting to track down and recover copies of the daguerreotype that had caused his family such pain. In 1889, James published a small pamphlet titled A Family's Tragedy: The Truth About the Marlow Sisters, in which decades, but had never been officially documented. According to James, Elizabeth's eyes in the photograph were not merely open, but seemed to hold an expression of awareness that was impossible to mistake for the vacant stare of death. Her position, while carefully arranged by the photographer, showed subtle signs of movement that suggested she had shifted during the exposure. Most disturbing of all was what James described as the unmistakable appearance of breath moving beneath the fabric of her dress. The pamphlet also revealed that the Marlow family had received numerous offers to purchase copies of the daguerreotype over the years, suggesting that a thriving market existed for such macabre curiosities. James wrote bitterly of collectors who viewed his sister's suffering as nothing more than an interesting addition to their collections of photographic oddities. By the 1890s, the story of the Marlow sisters had evolved far beyond the tragic facts of premature burial and photographic evidence. Local folklore had transformed Elizabeth into a ghostly figure who appeared near Millfield Cemetery on moonless nights, still wearing her burial dress and searching for the sister who had preceded her into death. These supernatural embellishments served to obscure the real lesson of the Marlow case, that the boundary between life and death was far more uncertain than medical science of the period was willing to acknowledge, and that photography, still a relatively new technology, could reveal truths that human observation might miss. The legacy of the Marlow sisters extends far beyond the boundaries of their small Massachusetts town or the decades immediately following their tragic deaths. Their story speaks to fundamental questions about the nature of life and death that continue to challenge medical science and human understanding to this day. In the mid-19th century, when the Marlow tragedy occurred, the determination of death was largely a matter of careful observation by trained physicians. The absence of breath, the stillness of the heart, the cooling of the body, these were the signs that medical professionals relied upon to make the most final of all diagnoses. Yet, as the case of Elizabeth Marlow demonstrated, even experienced physicians could be deceived by conditions that mimicked death so close, suggesting that Elizabeth's fate, while tragic, was not unique. The development of more sophisticated methods for determining death, including the use of mirrors to detect breath, needles inserted under fingernails to test for responses to pain, and later electrical stimulation of muscles, came largely as a response to cases like that of the Marlow sisters. The role of photography in revealing Elizabeth's condition speaks to another important development of the mid-19th century: the emergence of new technologies that could capture details invisible to human observation. The daguerreotype process, with its incredibly fine resolution and ability to record the slightest variations in light and shadow, proved capable of detecting signs of life that had escaped the notice of trained medical professionals. Jonathan Blake's camera had essentially functioned as a diagnostic instrument, revealing physiological evidence that contradicted the official medical determination of death. The dilated pupils, the subtle chest movement, the slight change in position. These details, captured in silver and preserved on the daguerreotype plate, provided a record of life persisting within apparent death. The broader implications of the Marlow case extended beyond medical practice to touch upon philosophical and spiritual questions that had troubled humanity since the beginning of recorded history. If the boundary between life and death could be so uncertain, what did this mean for beliefs about the soul, consciousness, and the nature of human existence? Victorian society, with its elaborate mourning rituals and obsession with death, was particularly vulnerable to the anxieties raised by cases of premature burial. The possibility that loved ones might be conscious and suffering within their graves challenged fundamental assumptions about the peace and finality of death. The Marlow daguerreotype gave visual form to these fears, creating an image that seemed to document the very moment when life and death existed simultaneously within the same body. The photograph also raised disturbing questions about the nature of photography itself. If a camera could capture evidence invisible to human eyes, what other hidden truths might photographic technology reveal? The idea that photography could see beyond the apparent surface of reality contributed to both scientific. Whitmore's confidence in his diagnosis, while based on the best medical knowledge available to him, proved tragically insufficient to prevent Elizabeth's horrible fate. The daguerreotype that revealed his error served as a permanent reminder of the limitations of human knowledge and the need for humility in the face of life's greatest mysteries. As we reflect on this tragedy from the perspective of the 21st century, with our advanced medical technology and sophisticated understanding of neurological conditions, it is easy to feel superior to the physicians and photographers of 1853. Yet the fundamental questions raised by the Marlow case remain as relevant today as they were more than a century ago. When does life truly end? How can we be certain that consciousness has departed? What truths might our instruments reveal that our senses cannot detect? These questions continue to challenge medical professionals, philosophers, and anyone who has ever stood beside a deathbed and wondered about the mystery of the transition from life to death. The daguerreotype of the Marlow sisters, whether it survives in some forgotten collection or was destroyed long ago, represents more than a photographic curiosity or a medical tragedy. It stands as a monument to the persistence of mystery in human experience, and a reminder that even in an age of advancing scientific knowledge, the most fundamental questions about existence remain tantalizingly beyond our complete understanding. In the end, the story of Sarah and Elizabeth Marlow is not just about premature burial or the early days of photography. It is about the terrible weight of uncertainty that accompanies every human decision, the limitations of knowledge in the face of the unknown, and the profound responsibility that comes with making judgments about life and death. The photograph captured a moment when these uncertainties became visible, frozen in silver and light, for anyone brave enough to look directly at the evidence of their own fallibility. In that image, if it indeed existed as described, lay a truth too disturbing for its era to fully confront, that the boundary between life and death is not a clear line, but a shadowy borderland where certainty gives way to mystery, and where the most confident diagnoses can conceal the most